Everyone, let's go ahead and get started. It's 11:25. Thank you all for coming to my talk. It's titled Quick Iteration in Elixir. Today we'll be talking about some of the things that I've learned over 6 years of working with Elixir professionally and personally as a hobbyist, and just sharing different things that are hopefully helpful for everybody. So first, a little bit about me. I really care about the community. As part of that, I am a moderator on the Elixir forum. I've contributed tons of PRs to various Elixir projects. Occasionally I've been Elixir LS core contributor, a little bit less now than in the past. You can follow me on Twitter. And I'm also an engineering manager at Felt, and a maintainer of various open source projects like XSync, Scenic Library Load, Nerves Library Load, which is coming soon, and DevViz. You may notice that there's a common theme running through all those applications, all being around sort of like library loading and quicker development, and that totally ties into everything I'll be talking about today. Let's start off with a little bit about my philosophy. So I believe as programmers, we should really care about our craft. Earlier on in my career, or actually in college, I read The Pragmatic Programmer, which is a book that I would just highly recommend to anybody that's interested in programming, no matter where you are in your career. Also, I believe that investing some time in your tools will pay dividends over the course of your career and just add up over time and help you be more productive and effective. One thing that's really important is to have shorter feedback cycles in general and in development. So a feedback cycle in general is that you're making some sort of change in the world, and then you observe what the result is, and then based on that result, you use that as feedback to make another change, and then you observe again, and you just do this loop multiple times. So reducing the speed of that loop allows you to move and learn quicker. A simple example of a feedback cycle in code is you write some code, then you run it, you observe the result, and you get some feedback, and you use that to write a new version of your code. And this expands into other larger loops. So after you write the code, maybe you create a pull request on GitHub, somebody reviews it, gives you feedback, and you create a new version of the code that's hopefully better, and you push it up for more review again. And eventually that code then gets deployed to production, where now you're getting feedback from a user, and you're using that feedback to improve your code even more. And if you zoom out even further, then you're actually basically getting feedback from the market. And the point is that all of these feedback cycles compound. So if you're improving the speed of your local development, then you're also improving the speed of PR feedback, and then customer feedback, and your market feedback. I have a few goals for this talk today. I'd like you to walk away caring more about your craft than when you came in. I want to inspire you to try a few new tips and techniques, and motivate you to think in terms of feedback cycles and how you can reduce them in your development, and perhaps even in your life. I'll also say what this talk is not. So this talk is not a rebuttal to the idea that you should spend more time thinking than typing. I think that is very true. I'm just focusing on the typing part today, partially because by being able to have that typing part being very simplified, you will be able to stay in like a state of flow and not have like all these like roadblocks where you're getting interrupted all the time. The slides will be on my GitHub. I'll be going pretty quickly today, so don't worry about taking too many notes. So let's warm up. So IEX is awesome. One of my biggest tips is just get familiar with IEX, try all the different functions, try out your code in there. I use that whenever I'm prototyping any sort of new module I'm about to create. One super simple tip to start with is if you use recompile in Elixir, you can get your changes. You can get your changes of your project. So here on the left, I just have a very simple starter Phoenix project, and it's going to write a function here, def hi do io.puts hello ElixirConf. And actually, before I save that, I will start up the server on the right here. And now I save this file, and so I try to call this function. but there's an error because that code hasn't actually been compiled yet. So because I started this with IEX-s mix, I can run recompile here, and the code gets recompiled. And now if I run the function, I get the results. One thing that sometimes trips people up is, so say I make another change here, and I'd add 2022 to it, and then in a different terminal window here at the bottom, this could be something happening like somewhere in your editor. I run mix compile, and this also compiles the code, those Elixir source files, into Beam files on disk. And then I try to call hello-phoenix.hi here, and I get the old code. And then, okay, maybe I'll just type recompile, and I'll get the new code. Nope, it's still the old code. So what's happening here is that Elixir is looking for the modification timestamps on the source files, and because it's already been compiled, it's not recompiling it. One way to kind of get around that is to use the R helper in IEX. So you do R, and you pass the module name hello Phoenix, and it'll reload the file from disk. And then when you call it, now you're getting the new code. There's lots of other helpers in IEX. Some basic ones here are H to get information about a function or a module, I to find details about a variable, and B to get help with different callback functions. So I will close this other window, and so I can do like H, enum.map. It's pretty basic. You can also do that for anything in your project. So H, hello Phoenix will get you these docs that you're defining up here in your module doc. I really like the I helper if I have like some super large map that's like printing out over a bunch of screens. Because sometimes it can be hard to tell, like, oh, do I actually have an OK error tuple, or do I have the actual map? So when you use I, you can see the, okay, this is what the data type is. It's a tuple. It's not a map. And you can see like what protocols are implemented. Some other fun things here is like there's a runtime info where you can see your information about what's being run. And if you type H, you can get a list of all the different helper functions here. So like you can see recompile here. Another good one to get familiar with is V, where you can get the results of any command that you ran in IEX up to this point. Kernel.inspect is just another function to be familiar with. It's really helpful to have this in Elixir. I wish we had something like this in other languages where you can just inspect any term or variable and you get a string representation. And usually you can then take that string and actually put it back into IEX and get the same result out, but not for every data type. Some of that will be improved in Elixir 1.14, which I'm excited for. Just something to be aware of. Another really fun IEX tip is that you can actually use IEX to open up any source file of your project in your editor. And the way you do that is setting the environment variable Elixir_editor. And here's an example for how to set up that for VS Code. So if I go inside IEX, and I've already set that environment variable, so I just open up enum.map, and then VS Code loads and directly to the first line of the enum.map function. So I think that can be very helpful. And then you can look at the implementation, all the function heads, etc. Some other IEX tips. People are always running into issues with char lists. I see this as an issue like daily on the Elixir Slack or the forum or the Discord. There's a way to tell IEX to not print out the result as a char list. So by default, if you have a list of strings, or sorry, a list of integers that can be printed as ASCII characters, then Elixir will print them out as a char list, which is what that ABC with single quotes is, not double quotes. But after you do IEX.configure, you can actually print out as a list. And here's what that looks like as a demo. Another thing, sometimes when I'm developing, I will accidentally create an infinite loop. Usually they're a lot not as obvious as this one is, but there is a way to get around that. And in case you didn't know, you can actually just create modules directly inside of IEX, which is pretty cool too. So here's, oops, I'm mistyping that. Def loop, do loop, and I guess there's a module, and then I call it. And now my terminal's hung. I press enter, I type hi, nothing happens. So what do? Do you Control-C, Control-C No. So instead, you do this like basically like a magic incantation. So you press Control G, I, enter, C, enter. And then now that loop has been aborted, and you're back at your terminal prompt, and you can see anything you had typed while everything was locked up. So I think that's really cool. If you want to see what else is available via that special like Control G menu, which is built into the Erlang shell, which is what IEX is built on top of, you can press Control G and then H. And then you can see what we just did was that first helper here, I, to interrupt a job, and then C to connect to that job again after you've interrupted it. Another fun thing here is the J helper, which you can see all the different shells, and you can even start a new shell. It's really easy to start an Erlang shell, just to do S. And then now when I see, when I do press J again, I can see the other shells, and I'll connect to that Erlang shell with C2, and now I'm at the Erlang shell, and then I can go back with C1, and now I'm back at IEX prompt. And the other shell is still running. Another really cool thing with IEX is that you can actually auto-close brackets. So say you had typed like a bunch of random brackets. That was not valid syntax. And then you forget like, oh, what bracket is next? You can just hit Control square bracket a bunch of times, and it'll automatically close all the brackets. There's a caveat to that, which is it will not auto-close strings for you. I did see somebody mentioning this on the Elixir mailing list, I think a few weeks ago. Hopefully that goes somewhere. I think this is a feature that's built into the Erlang shell, so hopefully someone can create a PR to improve that. Another good tip for IEX is there's an IEX configuration file, .iex.exs. One downside to it is you can only have one IEX configuration file for any IEX session, but there is a way around that with that first snippet that I have listed here, which is just checking if the user has a .iex.exs in their home directory. And if it does, then it imports that file, and then it continues on. So if you have like an application, that might be a good thing to put as the first line in your IEX configuration. But inside there, you can put things like aliasing your repo function or your user, so you don't always have to type my app, which gets a little bit annoying, especially if you made the potential mistake of creating a really long my app namespace. And this might be also a place where you'd want to put in your IEX.configure charlist as lists so that you don't have to look at charlists in your code or in your IEX sessions. Also, IEX is able to save your shell history, and it's not something that happens by default. So by default, if you had closed out IEX and you go back into it, and then you press up, you don't get any history here. So if you haven't enabled that, you should definitely use those incantations from the previous slide, and you can also do like Control R to like look at like things you've called in the past by passing a search like readline. Now let's move on to some Elixir tips. So one thing that I find handy when I'm developing is sometimes I'm working with like, some dependency. Then I want to try and make some changes to it, whether I'm adding an inspect to it, or maybe tweaking the output, having it call a different server rather than whatever it's configured for. And one way you can do that is once you've actually downloaded the dependency, you just change your dependency to be a path dependency, and you just pass it the path to the deps folder where it already exists. And then now, whenever you make changes in that folder, you can restart IEX to recompile and get those changes back in. And you do have to restart IEX. You can't just use recompile for that, because that'll only recompile your project. And if you're using the Phoenix code reloader, then you can recompile path dependencies by setting the reloadable apps in your endpoint configuration. The docs for that are in the Phoenix code reloader.reload. That can be handy if you only have a few dependencies that you want to be recompiling all the time. But the way that I really like to recompile any path dependencies is with the library XSync that I help maintain. And so XSync is a library that will watch all of your source files, and it'll recompile any code as soon as you save the file. And you don't have to do any sort of like page refresh they would have to do with like Phoenix code reloader. So it's just very, very quick, I guess. So let's do a demo of that. So I will go into my mix.exs for this project and enable XSync, and I just have it locally so that I don't have to depend on the conference Wi-Fi. And restart my Phoenix server here. Okay, and then I'll just create a new function here, hi2, and I'll just call it, let's do a hi to say a second function. And then now, as soon as I save the file, XSync saw that I saved the file, and it recompiled the project, and then it reloaded that module for me. So now I type hello Phoenix .hi2, and I get the second version of the function, or the second function, which is pretty cool. But we can do even better than that. So if we go back into IEX here, and then if I change this to be a path dependency, so this is Slugify is a simple library that will take like a human readable string and convert it to just be like words plus a hyphen in between. So just do dep/slugify, save that, and then now I have to restart IEX so that it'll use that path dependency. And okay, let's create a function that now uses that. So back in hello Phoenix, I'll just call it slug. So slug.slugify, and I'll pass in a title here. Okay, and now when I do hello Phoenix.slug, and I'll pass it just hello ElixirConf, and it returns the slug for me. And if I want to modify that, I'll combine it with the previous tip, and I'll do open slug.slugify in an editor. And now, so here's the function, and I'll go down to somewhere at the bottom and modify the result. So we just use then, pass it slug, and as the modification, I will add a snail icon, because that's the closest emoji I could find to a slug. And paste that in and append it with the slug here, and then I'll save the file here and switch back, and you see it's already being recompiled. And when I call that function again, the slug is prepended. So this is just a really thank you. So this is a really easy way to do a quick prototype of modifying a dependency. Then maybe after this, you actually go and like fork the repository, clone it locally, make the change, and submit it as a PR. Hopefully, if you're trying to improve the dependency. Cool, that's how I like to use XSync. Another thing is I think that editor snippets are just very underused by lots of developers. I see people like creating weird helper functions in their library or in their applications just so they don't have to like, when they could just create a snippet and then they don't have to like pollute their like library or application namespace. Here's a few snippets that I like to use. There's one called LIN for a labeled inspect. A lot of them are based on IO inspect. And then like I have similar thing for piping and also for logging. And then I'll show you the key one in a second. So let's just see how that kind of looks. So say we have our function here, and I want to see, perhaps this title is coming in somewhere deep within the system, say, and I just want to see what it looks like. So I just type LIN tab, and I type title, and then it's filled out this whole io.inspect for me. And like fraction of time it would take me to type out this whole thing. And one of the fun things about how I have this set up is it'll actually input the file name and the line number as part of the snippet. So if I had like modified it, maybe I put like new title, I don't know, bad example. And then I want to inspect it again. I just do that again, and then now it's gotten a different line number, 17. So I can tell the difference between these two invocations. And so you can see when I call the function, now title is printed out twice with the separate line number for each of them. And so say we wanted to return a map from this function, maybe with the slug and the original title. So you create a map here, and then this is where I have my K-helper that's very tiny but very useful because Elixir doesn't have anything like shorter maps. So I just type K-tab, and then I type whatever key value I want to use, and then it's inputting on both sides of the map for me, the key and the value. Then I can do the same thing for the title. And that's, I don't know, I use that all the time. It's very handy. So here's how creating a snippet looks like in VS Code. It looks a little bit intimidating. It's like a JSON blob. But once you have one as an example, it's not too bad to input and customize it to be your own. So this one is from Isaac Yonemoto, who uses the prefix INS to trigger it, and this is how you put in that relative file path and line number in VS Code, which is where I got the idea initially from Isaac. And here's a similar snippet, but in Y snippet for Emacs, which is what I use as my main editor. Another tip, moving on, is to customize your editor. I am somewhat biased, but I definitely recommend installing Elixir LS. It's very handy for like looking at the help of your functions to find out the docs. You can use it to go to definition for any libraries, and you can even use go to definition on Elixir source code. But right now you have to have Elixir installed via source, compiled via source in order for that to work. But it should be theoretically possible to like detect that, okay, we're trying to go to definition on Elixir source, and it will like, send you to like GitHub or some download like the code locally and then open it up. So if you're interested in that, maybe you can contribute a PR. Some other general Elixir tips is tracing is really helpful if you want to see the, you can see anywhere in your system when a specific module or function is being called, you can see the input to that function and the output to that function. And you can even do this in production, which is really cool. So some good tracing libraries are Rexbug and ReconX. I'm really looking forward to Elixir 1.14, which will release the DBG macro, which will let you inspect a full pipeline to see the results of all of that, all in like one step. Phoenix Live Dashboard is really cool. I definitely recommend the Ecto plugin if you are using Ecto, because you can see all like your table stats, which indexes are being overused or underused, and it can just be really helpful. Or even not used at all, which is just a waste of memory and space. Livebook is also really cool to define modules and share them with people and just play with things in that and create graphs and visual output. But who here uses Git? Okay, yeah, I thought so. Everybody's using Git these days, so I like to customize Git a lot. I have a lot of Git aliases, so I don't recommend that you have more than 100 Git aliases. But here are the top 4 that I do recommend you try out. So the first one here is GWIP. So say you are working on a branch, working on your PR, and then you need to like suddenly drop and do like a hot fix for production. Not that ever happens to me. And so what you just do is you GWIP, and it'll add all the files in your working directory, and it'll commit it as a work in progress commit. And I like this better than git stash, because with git stash, it's kind of similar, but then it doesn't actually track like which branch you stashed from. And then if you go back to like a branch and you try to reapply the stash, maybe you have like a conflict, and then you have to like clear the stash after, and then I've lost work that way. So I just like to use this instead. If you are using GitHub, I really recommend the GH helper, which is GitHub's command line client. That's super helpful. So my GPO alias here will check out any PR of the current repository. So I'm always using that to check out one of my coworkers' PRs. So it's just like GPO space and the PR number. Makes it really, really quick. Also, the git status output is very verbose by default. And I'll just show you what that looks like. So inside here, so you have git status, and you can see, okay, some files have been modified, but they're ready to be committed. Some have not been staged, and they won't be committed. And you have like all this like helper thing about what you should do. So if you instead do git status short -- branch, which is my GT alias, then you get a very, very compact version where you can see just the branch that you're on. You can see which file was modified but not committed, and some of that actually makes it easier to see which ones are partially staged, like the mix.ass, which is showing up in both of these lists here. And if you ever forget like what these colors or the letters mean, you can just type git status, and like the colors even match, which is nice. So this capital blue M is the same as a modified here, and similar for the M's over here. And I also really like this GPU alias, which will push up your current branch and set it to be tracking. And then it'll automatically open up a web browser in GitHub's UI so you can create the PR. And I find that really helpful because I always like to attach screenshots and videos before I actually initially create the PR. So I can do it all in one step. and very quickly. And this is partially how I've created so many pull requests. So another tip with Git. So I'm often tracking some of my coworkers' branches, and sometimes they've like rebased their code because they're the only ones working on it, and then so now I have like an outdated local version of it. So I got tired of having to always type git reset --hard and like origin/Tyler/new feature. And so instead you can do git reset hard and do @_u close curly bracket, and it'll reset to the origin branch for whatever branch you are tracking. So you can get their latest code locally. Also, if you're using the command line a lot, I recommend using TIG. It's a really great command line Git client. It's super fast, and you can browse and to see what all the commits are. You can get the SHAs and the details of what changed. Also with Git, another fun tip is this horribly named Git feature called re, which stands for reuse recorded resolution. So say you are rebasing 10 commits, and the first 2 commits have like some relatively minor merge conflicts. Maybe it takes like a couple minutes to fix each of them. But then you get to commit 7 and has like a horrible merge conflict, and you need to pull in like a coworker to like understand like, oh, what is this code actually supposed to be doing? And then so before you can do that, you have to wait for them to be available, and you so you do a git rebase abort, and then when you get back to them, you do git rebase again, and you are, let's see, where was I? And then you have to go through those first 2 commits and fix those merge conflicts again, even though you already did it. So enabling re will tell Git to save your save the conflict resolutions that you told it, so you don't have to keep doing the same thing multiple times. Now let's talk about libraries, starting with Phoenix. So one thing that's been very helpful for us at Felt is for every PR that is created, we automatically create a separate application and database, and we pre-fill that with a bunch of seed data. So this is really helpful for any reviewers, because if they want to look at the result of a PR, all they have to do is click one of the links on the pull request, and it's just so much friendlier for any non-technical members, because like your designer is not going to like check out your branch locally, pull it down, build it, fix any conflicts or database issues, just to see like if some UI thing needs to be moved by like a few pixels. So this is something I definitely recommend to any team. I want to create a blog post about it soon. We'll see. But I did talk about it on the Thinking Elixir podcast a couple of weeks ago, which was a lot of fun and worth checking out if you're interested. Phoenix comes with a mixed setup alias. It's very useful, especially if you're switching branches. So I just recommend that you maintain it and use it so that every time after you switch branches, you can call it, and maybe it'll install any front-end dependencies you need. It can call any data migrations. And so whenever you're changing branches, you don't have to think, oh, do I have to run mixed-steps.get? Do I have to run npm install? No, you can just run mixed setup, and everything will be done for you. Observer is a really great tool for looking at all the processes that you're running. I found if I have a newer computer that has a lot of cores, it can be a little noisy in Phoenix. So here's an example of my 12-core desktop machine, and you can see the scroll bar is only showing like a quarter of the processes here. So that's what happens by default, because so many things are based on the number of processors that you have. But you can clean it up pretty easily, and then afterwards you can actually see like, oh, all these processes now fit easily on one screen, and you can see here's the endpoint, and here's like the telemetry things, and then you'd have your rest of your supervision tree probably somewhere down below here if you had like a real application. And the way you do that is in your dev.exs config, you set transport options for your endpoint to like num acceptors 2, so hard code it, and then similarly for the live view socket, you can set the number of partitions for each socket. So by default, that's your live view socket and your code reloader socket. I also really recommend using compile time configuration, or not using compile time configuration when possible. That way you don't have to suffer through like a large full project compile whenever you are changing any of your configuration. And another benefit is that you can then use config providers, which only work at runtime. You can read more about that on the blog if you're interested. Also, if you're interested in compile time dependencies, I wrote a project called DepViz, which gives you like a graphical view of what which files in your project will cause compile time dependencies on which other projects. So this is not generally what you want, where there's like, this is 32 compile dependencies on one file. So you want to try to keep that minimized. And there's another tip for that later. So I believe you should also make the bots work for you. So to do that, one way is to use xref compile connected. So if you use label compile connected fail above 0 as part of your CI, then whenever you're about to push a PR, that will actually create like a compile time loop. It'll warn you, and the CI will fail, so you won't make that mistake. So what you're avoiding there is having like a set of like 10 files or something that all depend on each other. And when any of those files are touched, then all of them have to be recompiled. So that's just a real bummer whenever you're trying to recompile and do some work. Mixed format is great. You can reduce the amount of nitpicking in your team. And you can enforce that in CI as well. I also really like Credo. I don't like all the defaults, so you have to customize it a little bit. But it's very, very helpful too. I have a few meta tips. As programmers, we're always coming across problems. That's what we're doing. We're problem solvers. And sometimes we come across problems multiple times. So I think that the second time you encounter a problem, you should just write down yourself a short note. Because if you encountered it a second time, you're probably going to encounter it again. So having the note there will help you to remember what it was. And then you can come back later, and maybe you'll even make like a short blog post about it or create like a TIL and help the community that way. Also, pairing with other developers has always been very helpful. I always learn something new basically every time I pair with somebody. Something about their workflow, some new tool they're using or trying. I kind of liken it to a sort of programmer's like oral history or tradition, which is a fun way to learn things. If you're trying to put some of these tips into practice, one way to help that is like, rather than like, say you're about to type IOInspect manually rather than using a snippet, you can just say, okay, even though I've already typed IOInspect, I'll actually backspace over that and use a snippet. Because that way you're building the muscle memory to use a snippet. You can even do that a few times in a row to really start to build that muscle memory. My largest overall tip is tool sharpening. So this is something that I like to do as a daily-ish practice, or maybe weekly, where I'll spend 5 to 10 minutes in the morning, maybe with my coffee, where I'm just working on my tools, I'm polishing them, I'm improving some of my snippets or aliases or whatever else. And it's just something that's been really helpful for me, because over time, all this improvement compounds and just makes your workflow that much better. And as part of that, I also keep all of this in a doc. And so when I'm doing my actual work, and I encounter some snag or issue, I just write it in the doc to look at later, so that I'm not messing around in Emacs config when I should be shipping a feature or fixing a bug. So that's been helpful for me. But most of all, I believe you should have fun. Programming should be fun. Thank you.